In Sir Giles's study, Holmes said. Exactly, Geoffrey said. He was the perfect suspect. He was guilty, just not of murder. But you made sure his crimes were uncovered, I said, so no one would look further. It was elegant, Geoffrey replied. Too elegant, perhaps. You saw past it. Holmes tilted his head. You underestimated Lydia Arbuthnot, and you underestimated the one person she trusted to make sense of it. Geoffrey said nothing more. Lestrade moved forward, snapped the cuffs around his wrists, and read him the formal charge in a low, firm tone. We returned to the drawing room, where a footman no longer stood waiting at the door. Holmes sat heavily for the first time that day, his fingers laced before him, elbows on his knees. The room felt colder now, though the fire burned bright. I suspected it when Courtenay described the man in the robe, he said. Sir Giles was not at home, but the only other man with freedom of movement, knowledge of the household, and access to Lydia's room at that hour, was the footman. He'd been invisible precisely because he was expected. A ghost in his own house. He played them all against each other, I said. Even Giles. He exploited every secret, Holmes replied. And for a time he succeeded. We sat in silence for a while after Lestrade departed with his prisoner. Outside, the fog had lifted slightly, revealing the distant outline of the city once more. Holmes spoke at last. She was trying to do good, Watson. That's the part that haunts me. Lydia Arbuthnot wanted only to set things right. She had no thought of profit, no agenda but truth, and paid the price for it, I said softly. She did, Holmes said, rising slowly. But not in vain. He turned away, already lost in some distant thread of thought. I watched him pace to the window, silhouetted once again in that familiar stance. London pulsed faintly beyond the glass. Another case closed, another truth unearthed. Next, section 9. Aftermath. The culprit is in custody, but the consequences ripple on. Holmes and Watson reflect on the cost of truth, the reputations shattered, and the emotional toll. Loose ends are tied. The story edges toward a quiet close. Shall I proceed with the next section? The morning after Geoffrey Harker's arrest dawned with brittle clarity. The fog had lifted entirely, leaving the city sharp-edged under a pale blue sky. I awoke later than usual to find Holmes already at the breakfast table, half-finished toast beside a stack of newspapers he scarcely glanced at. He was not reading. He was brooding. Lestrade wired, he said without looking up. The confession has been taken. Geoffrey signed it without resistance. I poured coffee and joined him. There'll be a trial, of course. Undoubtedly, Holmes murmured. Though I suspect it will be a quiet affair. The Crown will suppress the more sensitive disclosures. Sir Giles's financial improprieties, the forged government documents. What cannot be erased will be softened. And Lady Fenwick. Released, he replied, his mouth thinning. The charges were withdrawn before she ever saw the dock. The official line will claim she was overcome by grief. A medical leave abroad will soon follow, I expect. And Giles? Likely to vanish into one of his foreign investments, Holmes said, gesturing vaguely. A discreet posting in Cairo, perhaps. Or Buenos Aires, somewhere far enough to let the embers cool. I said nothing for a while. The case, now resolved, hung heavily in my mind. Not for its complexity, we had faced more intricate webs of deceit, but for its bitter conclusion. There had been justice, yes, but no triumph. Holmes stirred his coffee absently, then set the spoon down. I find myself troubled, he said quietly. Because you misjudged the direction of the investigation. No, he said, looking up. Because I judged it correctly. I frowned. We knew from the beginning that there was something off about the alibis. Holmes continued. The woman who claimed 2 alibis, Lady Fenwick, turned out to be merely a decoy. We were expected to look at her. Every action was arranged to direct suspicion her way, and for a time we obliged. But what grieves me, Watson, is how thoroughly the truth was hidden behind the mundanity of servants. He stood pacing toward the window. Geoffrey Harker was not clever in the way the newspapers will describe him. He wasn't a mastermind. He simply knew how to remain invisible. It is a unique sort of evil, the quiet kind. The kind that slips between the steps of the staircase and is never noticed until too late. I looked at him, feeling the old admiration stir again, that rare melancholy that visited Holmes only in the wake of cases where justice had been won, but something deeper had been lost. She was brave, I said. Miss Arbuthnot. Yes, Holmes said without turning. More than any of them. We spent that afternoon at Scotland Yard, delivering final notes to Lestrade and reviewing the last of the documents taken from the Fenwick residence. Among them was the true diary of Lydia Arbuthnot, recovered from its hiding place beneath a loose floorboard behind the wainscoting in her room. It was Holmes who had remembered the chipped varnish along the wall and deduced it might conceal something more than bad carpentry. Her entries were brief but revealing. In her calm, methodical script, she chronicled not only her daily lessons and household obligations, but her growing unease. Her sense of being watched followed. Her distrust of Sir Giles was evident, but what struck me most was her tone. Not frightened, not even indignant, but resolute. October 27th. He knows I've seen the letters. I will not yield. Truth must have weight, or what are we teaching these children? November 4th. I no longer believe Margaret is part of this. She has secrets, yes, but she does not lie as he does. I begin to suspect Geoffrey. Too quiet. Too often at my door under pretense of errands. November 6th. I've told Basil everything. Left notes with Darnley as well. If I don't return, they must act. Holmes handed the book to Lestrade, with more care than he typically afforded any object not containing a chemical compound. Let this be preserved, he said. Her voice must remain intact. Lestrade nodded gravely. It will. You have my word. We left the yard as the sun dipped behind the rooftops. That evening, Holmes refused dinner, instead retreating to his armchair with his violin, coaxing low meditative tones that curled and lingered like the fading echoes of the case itself. I sat across from him, letting the music speak in place of words. At one point he paused, bow hovering. Do you recall, he said, when I told you that secrets often wear the trappings of silence? I do. This case will stay with me for that reason. Not because of its intricacies, not even because of its outcome, but because of how easily evil wore a plain face and stood in plain sight. He played a few more notes, then fell still. I wonder, he said, how many Geoffreys pass us by in a lifetime, unremarkable, unobserved, and how many Lydias are left unheard, until it's too late. His words stayed with me long after the fire dimmed. The next day brought the first whisper of the case to the papers, brief, unspecific and carefully edited. Household tragedy in Cadogan Square. Family in mourning. No public inquest to be held. The story would pass as such things often do, replaced in time by fresher scandals. But the truth, we knew, had been recorded where it mattered. A week later we received a letter, unsigned, though we knew the hand. It bore a single line. Thank you for finding her voice. Holmes smiled faintly as he folded the page and set it beside the diary. Let us hope, he said, we never grow deaf to such voices again. The days that followed were uneventful in the most welcome sense. The fog had given way to crisp, sunlit mornings, and Baker Street returned to its usual rhythm. Papers delivered precisely at 8, the boy from Bartleby's chemist making his weekly rounds, and the echo of hooves and wheels steadily passing beneath our window. Yet though London marched onward, unshaken as ever by the darkness it so often concealed, I noticed that Holmes lingered more than usual by the fire, his gaze frequently drawn to the small envelope and diary still resting on the edge of the mantelpiece. He had not reopened either since receiving them, nor had he spoken of Lydia Arbuthnot again. It was on the third evening after the final resolution of the case that I returned from a visit to the apothecary to find him not in his chair, nor at the lab table, but standing at the window with a pipe unlit between his fingers. The violin was untouched, the day's post unopened. Anything from Lestrade? I asked, hanging my coat. The magistrate's hearing must be scheduled soon. Nothing of interest, he murmured. Geoffrey Harker has been remanded to Brixton. The full trial will be held under sealed record, as expected. Giles Fenwick has booked passage to Alexandria. He sails next week. He did not turn as he spoke, and for a moment I simply watched him, framed against the late blue of the sky. I wonder sometimes, he said after a pause, whether there is more merit in the unspoken cases than in those that reach the newspapers. You mean those we never take? I asked, curious. I mean those we solve but do not declare, he said. The silent victories, the preserved reputations, the threats diffused without spectacle. He finally turned, walking slowly toward the fireplace and lowering himself into his chair. This case, Watson, this case was different, not for its structure, nor even for the cleverness of its players. It was different because it reminded me of what remains unseen in most inquiries. We are trained to seek motive, opportunity, and method, but rarely do we account for intention. For how often people become casualties not of hatred, but of carelessness, not malice, but silence. I nodded slowly. She believed in speaking up. She did, Holmes said. And it killed her. He fell quiet again. I sensed that there was more, something deeper pressing behind the words, but I had learned not to prod in such moments. Instead, I went to the sideboard and poured 2 glasses of brandy. When I handed him one, he took it with a faint smile of acknowledgement. We rarely receive thanks, I said after a moment. And rarer still do we see justice carried out so cleanly. But this time, Holmes, we did something. Her death will not be in vain. Holmes stared into the amber liquid for a long moment, then sipped. Perhaps, but I wonder how many others go unheard, unnoticed. Geoffrey Harker moved among his betters with total invisibility. How many like him exist now, tucked into households across this city? Too many, I said softly. And how many Lydias? He added. We sat in silence. The fire crackled. Outside, a carriage clattered past and faded into the distance. Eventually Holmes stood and returned to the mantel. He picked up the diary once more, gently, as one might lift an old photograph, and opened it to the final entry. I do not fear what may come. I only hope that when the time arrives someone will see clearly and act. He closed it again and placed it carefully back in its resting place. I set down my brandy. Are you taking another case? He shook his head. Not for a day or two. I think the city can endure without me until then. I smiled, a rare indulgence. Holmes returned to his chair, this time with the violin in hand. He tuned it absently, then drew the bow across the strings, softly at first, then with more surety. The melody he played was unfamiliar to me, but there was something restrained and noble in it. A minor key, and yet not mournful. As the music drifted through the room, I leaned back and let my mind wander. To Lydia Arbuthnot's quiet strength, to the trap of silence that nearly held, to the delicate precision with which Holmes had teased truth from shadows. And I thought, not for the first time, that there were few men in this world so devoted not merely to solving mysteries but to restoring the balance they disrupted. When the last note faded, Holmes set down the bow and looked over at me. Do you believe in justice, Watson? He asked, not flippantly, but with the barest tinge of something vulnerable. I believe in you, I said. He nodded once, then smiled. Good. For as long as men like Harker move unseen in the world, I fear I shall remain rather busy. We laughed together then, quietly, but with genuine ease. And for the first time in many days, Holmes seemed to let go of the weight he had carried. Outside, the lamps flickered to life, and a fresh wind rose from the river. London breathed on, and so did we. The following week passed in quiet rhythm, as if the city itself exhaled after holding its breath too long. The affair at Cadogan Square never made the scandal sheets. Geoffrey Harker's trial was held in camera, and though the verdict guilty on all counts was recorded in the official proceedings, no particulars were made public. Sir Giles Fenwick resigned his board seats and departed England with due haste, ostensibly on diplomatic duty. Lady Fenwick withdrew to the countryside, beyond reach of inquiry or curiosity. For Holmes, the conclusion of the case did not bring triumph, but reflection. The diary of Lydia Arbuthnot now rested in the locked drawer of his bureau, secured not for secrecy, but, as he said, for reverence. I had seen few cases affect him in quite the same way. It was not the complexity of the deduction, but the tragedy of its necessity that seemed to linger. We sat in our sitting room on a windless afternoon, the fireplace crackling low, the murmur of passing traffic muffled by drawn curtains. Holmes, pipe in hand, stared into the flames with that particular intensity he reserved for philosophical puzzles more vexing than any locked-room murder. "She was the only one who acted without pretense," he said at length. "No inheritance to protect, no secret ledger to conceal, no vanity to satisfy, merely principle." I nodded, having read the final entry in her diary once more that morning. "If I do not act now, no one else will, and I will have been complicit in my silence." The handwriting was steady to the end. "She exposed something larger than crime," Holmes continued. "She laid bare the quiet mechanisms by which people are made to disappear, not through violence, but through disregard. That is the greater deception, the subtle erasure of truth by those who know how to keep their voices low and their uniforms pressed." "And yet she endured," I said, "until the end. She believed someone would understand." Holmes's eyes turned to me. "And someone did." He rose then, crossing to the bureau. From the drawer he withdrew the letter Lady Fenwick had sent following her release, unsigned, with its single line of thanks. He unfolded it, rereading it not for information, but for tone. Then, almost reverently, he placed it within the diary's final page and shut the book. "She will not be forgotten," he said. That night, as the city prepared for another ordinary evening, shops closing, gaslights kindled, carriages clattering through the drizzle, we found ourselves once again in our familiar roles. Holmes tuned once more to the world's quiet irregularities, scanned telegrams and clippings in search of the next case. I took up my pen, setting down the record of the woman who claimed 2 alibis, and the invisible servant who wore no mask at all because no one ever looked. And as I wrote, I understood something Holmes had never said aloud, that sometimes the most important cases are not the ones which test his genius but the ones which remind him, and remind us, why such genius must be used at all. Another case closed, another shadow cast aside, and the fire as ever burned on. Fire as ever burned on. Fire as ever burned. We descended the steps into the rain, the shadows of the city once more closing around us. By the following morning the rain had passed, leaving the streets washed and slick under a wan November sun. The news of Sir Giles Fenwick's quiet arrest had not yet reached the public, and for now discretion remained the order of the day. Lestrade, having received Holmes's documentation and the diary pages with evident reluctance, had nevertheless agreed to proceed cautiously. No formal charges had been brought, no headlines printed. For the moment appearances were to be maintained. Holmes, however, was not satisfied. He stood at the center of our sitting room in Baker Street, fingertips pressed together beneath his chin, staring into the middle distance as if the final pieces of a puzzle were moving just beyond the reach of his thoughts. I watched him pace, 3 steps forward, pause, half turn, 3 steps back, as the Morning Post lay forgotten on the table between us. "You're unsettled," I observed. He halted. "There is something missing, Watson. Something small but essential." "You have the confession," I said. "You have the motive, the timeline, even the method." "I have a confession," Holmes corrected, resuming his pacing. "But whether it is entirely truthful, that remains to be seen. Sir Giles admitted to financial misdeeds, to corruption, and yes, to silencing Miss Arbuthnot. But I find myself questioning one key point: his willingness to admit guilt." "You think he's protecting someone?" Holmes turned abruptly. "No. I think he's controlling the narrative. A man like Giles Fenwick does not volunteer the full truth. He offers just enough to guide perception. There was guilt in him, yes, but too neatly wrapped, too composed. And the real puzzle, Watson, is that there were 2 deaths that night." I stared. 2. Holmes crossed to the mantel and removed a small parcel wrapped in brown paper, which had arrived earlier by private courier. He undid the twine and withdrew a bundle of documents, each marked with the seal of the Home Office. "These," he said, "are the contents of Lady Fenwick's sealed correspondence with the Ministry." Her father, Lord Elmhurst, held a position within the Foreign Office before his death. As it happens, he left behind certain encrypted records concerning investments, many of which passed quietly into Sir Giles's hands upon marriage. Lydia Arbuthnot, clever girl, had pieced together enough of the paper trail to prove that Sir Giles was not only laundering his debts through sham overseas accounts, but doing so by forging the names of deceased diplomats. He handed me a sheet, a bank transfer order dated 2 years prior, with a signature that had, upon comparison, clearly been lifted from a letter in the Elmhurst collection. "She didn't die for gossip," Holmes said grimly. "She died for truth, dangerous, bureaucratic truth, that could have buried him politically and financially." "But if the motive is secure," I asked, "what remains to uncover?" Holmes turned back toward the window, then spoke without turning. "Miss Arbuthnot returned home that night at 10:30. That much is clear. The housemaid confirmed hearing movement at that time, but the maid also said she thought she heard someone else leave after that. A second set of steps later. What if someone else saw her that night, spoke to her, someone Giles did not expect, and that someone," I said slowly, "might still be in danger?" Holmes's eyes met mine. "Exactly." Within the hour we were again en route to Chelsea, specifically, to the modest row house of Basil Courtenay. Holmes had arranged for Courtenay to meet us under the pretense of clarifying one final question regarding Lydia's previous employment. But as our cab neared the address, Holmes leaned toward me with uncharacteristic urgency. "Say little," he instructed. "Observe everything." We were shown into the sitting room, where Courtenay awaited, dressed with the same meticulous elegance as before but lacking his usual aloof charm. His movements were brisker. He offered no brandy this time. "I'll admit," he said, "I was surprised to hear from you again. I assumed the matter was concluded with Giles's confession." Holmes gave a slight smile. "So did I, and yet a single inconsistency gnawed at me, which was, why did you return to the Fenwick residence on the night of the murder?" Courtenay stiffened. "That's absurd. I was nowhere near Cadogan Square." "No," Holmes said lightly. "And yet a cabman, one of those silent observant fellows you thought unlikely to remember, saw you step from a cab at the corner of Wilton Place at 11:15. He recognized you again from your walk and posture when shown your photograph. He even recalled the cigarette case you used, silver, with a carved serpent, a rare design." Courtenay said nothing. His face had gone pale. Holmes continued, voice low. "You went to speak with Lydia Arbuthnot, perhaps to plead, perhaps to warn, perhaps merely to understand how much she knew. But you arrived after Sir Giles. You found her dead." Courtenay dropped into the chair behind him. "I thought," he began, then faltered. "I thought I was too late." "You were," Holmes said, sitting across from him. "But your silence afterward speaks volumes. You did not tell the police. You did not come forward. You allowed suspicion to settle on Margaret, and then Giles. What else could I do?" Courtenay said bitterly. "Giles had power. I had none. If I had spoken, I would have become part of the scandal myself, and I wasn't entirely sure what I'd seen." "What did you see?" Courtenay swallowed hard. "The light was on in her room, the door ajar. She lay on the floor, not yet cold, and someone was at the desk. A man. I saw only his back." "And this man?" Holmes asked. "I assumed it was Giles. He moved like him, but he wore no coat, just a black dressing robe." Holmes inhaled sharply. "Giles wasn't staying at the house." Courtenay shook his head. "No, but the man I saw, he was already there." We stared at each other for a beat, and I saw Holmes's eyes flash, not with surprise but with confirmation. He rose at once. "Come, Watson. We must speak to Lestrade. The truth is larger than we thought." I followed him out, Courtenay's bewildered protest trailing behind us. Once outside, I asked, "You've seen it now, haven't you?" "I have," Holmes said. "The trap is not for Giles, Watson. It never was." Giles returned. "Yes. But the true killer was already in the house. A man who moved freely without arousing suspicion. A man who knew the schedules of the staff, the household routines, and most importantly, where the diary was hidden." "Then who?" Holmes turned to me, eyes bright. "The footman, Geoffrey Harker, the quiet servant who opened the door for us. The man no one noticed." A gust of wind lifted the fog for a moment, revealing the black line of rooftops above us. "Come," Holmes said. "Tonight we lay the snare." The fog had returned by twilight, rolling low across Cadogan Square like a silent tide, softening the edges of gas lamps and casting long blurred shadows across the pavement. From our carriage I watched Holmes's profile, sharp and motionless, as we approached the Fenwick residence for what he assured me would be the final time. His eyes never left the mist-silvered view, but I knew the wheels of his mind were turning faster than ever. Inside the house, nothing had changed outwardly. The footman, Geoffrey Harker, answered the door with the same blank courtesy, taking our coats and leading us silently to the study. His manner was efficient, emotionless, unremarkable. Too unremarkable, now that I saw him through Holmes's eyes. Lestrade was already there, seated near the fire, his brow knitted in confusion. "I hope this is more than another theory, Holmes," he muttered. "I've 3 men in custody already, and the press are sniffing round the edges of this story like bloodhounds." "It's not a theory, Lestrade," Holmes replied evenly. "It's a demonstration. You'll understand everything in a moment." He turned to Geoffrey, who stood near the drinks tray with quiet expectancy. "Would you be so kind," Holmes said, "as to bring us the household's nightly register? The one Miss Arbuthnot used to record visitors and appointments." "Of course, sir," the man replied with a bow, and disappeared down the corridor. The moment the door closed, Holmes moved. "To the back stairs," he whispered to Lestrade. "We'll meet him before he reaches the office." We moved swiftly through the kitchen, and down the narrow servants' corridor, emerging into a passage lined with shelving. Geoffrey was already there, reaching toward a drawer in the filing cabinet. His hand paused, fingers hovering just above the handle. Holmes stepped into view. "That won't be necessary, Mr. Harker." The footman turned, a flicker of surprise crossing his usually placid features. "Sir, you won't find the register," Holmes said calmly, "because I removed it yesterday morning." Geoffrey straightened. His hands dropped to his sides. "I see. You were in the room when Lydia Arbuthnot returned that night," Holmes said. "Not Sir Giles, not Margaret. You, and you killed her." The footman looked at us, each in turn. Then very slowly, he smiled. "You really are as clever as they say," he murmured. "Though I didn't think you'd reach quite so far." Lestrade stepped forward. "Geoffrey Harker, you're under arrest." "Wait," Holmes interrupted, raising a hand. "Let him speak." Geoffrey looked toward Holmes again, and there was no longer any pretense in his eyes, only a weary candor, and something colder beneath. "I was here when she came in," he said. "She saw me. I hadn't expected that. She was meant to be gone longer, but she was calm, thought I was just clearing the coals, and I nearly let her go. But she saw what I was doing, copying entries from her diary. She asked questions. She understood too much, too quickly." He exhaled softly. "I'd come to know the family secrets, you see. They talk freely in front of the staff when they're comfortable, or drunk. I knew about Giles's embezzlement, knew where the letters were kept, even helped Margaret destroy 1 or 2. It gave me a kind of power. But Arbuthnot threatened that," Holmes said. "She wanted to expose everything," Geoffrey said with a shrug. "She believed truth meant something. She didn't understand how deep the rot went." Lestrade moved again, hand on his cuffs. "You murdered her for what, self-preservation?" Geoffrey's smile faded. "No, I murdered her because I had plans of my own." Holmes nodded once, almost to himself. "You intended to blackmail Sir Giles." "I already had," Geoffrey replied, with no hesitation. "For months. He thought it was Margaret, at first, then Courtenay. But he paid. That's all that mattered. And when Arbuthnot threatened to expose not just Sir Giles but the network behind him," Holmes said softly, "you saw everything slipping away. She was going to blow it all up." Geoffrey said, voice rising now. "The money, the leverage, the control I had over them. I couldn't allow that." "You knew she would go to the police," Holmes said. "So you arranged to find her in her room. You pretended to help, pretended to understand." "I gave her tea," Geoffrey said. "She drank it, even as she lectured me, said it wasn't too late to do the right thing. And then," Lestrade asked. "I stabbed her," he said. "Quick, no screaming, no mess. She collapsed without a sound, and I took her diary and hid it where no one would look. 2 alibis, 1 woman, and a murder no one saw coming. Welcome to Faded Echoes. I am your host Umbra. Let's grow this mystery-loving community. Comment and share where you're listening from. Your responses always bring a smile. Thank you for being here. It was on a bleak November morning in the year 1890 that I found myself once again ensconced in the familiar armchair beside the hearth of 221B Baker Street. Outside, a gray drizzle clung stubbornly to the windows, smearing the gaslight and rendering the city in hues of soot and melancholy. Holmes, sprawled across the settee with the languor of a cat, regarded the ceiling with the particular indifference he reserved for mornings without murder. "It is curious, Watson," he murmured, suddenly, without lifting his gaze. "The absence of crime is itself an unnatural state." I was about to respond, perhaps with some token protest about appreciating the peace, when the doorbell rang. Hudson's footsteps scurried down the hallway, and seconds later, the door to our sitting room opened to admit Inspector Lestrade of Scotland Yard, his face pinched and pale, his hat and coat damp with rain. Holmes sat up at once. "Ah, the game returns. You look winded, Lestrade. Sit, man. Tea, Watson." "No time for tea," Lestrade said, brushing off the offer with a wave. "We've a murder in Knightsbridge. Curious one, too. Thought you'd want a look." Holmes' eyes glittered. "Curious how?" Lestrade pulled a folded sheet of notepaper from his inner coat pocket and handed it to Holmes. "Miss Lydia Arbuthnot, 32, governess. Found this morning stabbed in her rooms at the home of her employer, Sir Giles Fenwick. She was discovered by a housemaid at 7:30. Single wound to the heart. No sign of forced entry. The household was locked tight." Holmes raised a brow. "And the Fenwicks?" "Sir Giles was out of town last night, dining at his club and sleeping at the Carlton. Confirmed by 3 witnesses. Lady Fenwick claims to have been at the theatre with friends, also corroborated. They had retired separately. The lady was the last to see Miss Arbuthnot, said good night around 10. An open and shut case of housemaid jealousy?" Holmes asked dryly. "Not this time," Lestrade replied grimly. "There's a witness, a cab driver, who swears Lady Fenwick didn't return home after the theatre. Says she went to a private residence in Chelsea, and didn't come back until near dawn. The woman she was supposedly with at the theatre says otherwise, that she and Lady Fenwick had tea together until midnight." Holmes tapped the paper with a slender finger. "2 conflicting alibis for 1 woman." "Exactly," Lestrade said. "And that's not all. The victim, Miss Arbuthnot, wrote a letter before her death, found on her desk. It simply says, 'The truth comes out tonight,' no matter what she says. No signature, but we verified the handwriting." Holmes rose, moving to the window with an eager stride. "A cryptic letter, a murder in a locked house, and a woman who claims to be in 2 places at once. My dear Lestrade, I applaud your instincts. Of course I shall come." Watson, quick to fetch his coat and revolver, caught Holmes' grin as he reached for his hat. "I smell secrets," he said. "And secrets, Watson, are my favorite perfume." Our cab rattled eastward through the mist-slicked streets of London, its wheels hissing over cobbles still damp from the early rain. Holmes sat motionless beside me, his gaze fixed on the swaying shadows beyond the fogged window, though I knew from long acquaintance that his thoughts were not on the passing scenery. A particular stillness settled over him in moments such as these, the calm of a man sharpening his mind like a blade before a duel. 2 alibis. I mused aloud, more to draw him out than from any expectation of enlightenment. "Both can't be true." "Just so," Holmes murmured. "And therein lies the puzzle. Surely it will come down to which friend is lying." Holmes tilted his head. "No, Watson, if it were merely a matter of 1 false alibi, the motive behind it would be our primary concern. But 2 accounts, each corroborated independently, suggest something subtler. Either Lady Fenwick has confederates in deception, or she is being framed by someone who possesses a rare talent for manipulation. And what of the victim's note? That line about the truth coming out tonight, could she have discovered something that threatened Lady Fenwick's position? A possibility, Holmes allowed, though it would be premature to affix any certainty. We must first examine the scene. Dead women tell no tales, but they often leave behind diaries, letters or misplaced items that whisper secrets louder than words. At that the cab slowed before a handsome Georgian townhouse on a quiet street just off Cadogan Square. A uniformed constable stood at the wrought-iron gate, lifting the latch without question at the sight of Lestrade. The inspector, who had arrived ahead of us, met us at the threshold. "Servants have been restricted to the lower floor," he said in a low voice, leading us inside. "The body is upstairs in the governess's quarters. Lady Fenwick is in her sitting room. We've not questioned her again, not yet." Holmes gave a short nod. "You were right to wait." The house was richly appointed, though not ostentatiously so. Mahogany paneling, velvet drapes, brass fittings, all the discreet trappings of inherited wealth. As we ascended the stairs, Holmes' fingers trailed lightly along the banister. At the landing he paused to examine a dislodged thread caught in the varnished wood. He pocketed it without a word. The governess's room was at the end of a narrow corridor, its door open. We stepped inside. Miss Lydia Arbuthnot lay still on the floor beside her writing desk. Her limbs were arranged in the haphazard sprawl of sudden death, her expression oddly peaceful. A single wound marked her chest, a dark blot on her white nightdress. Holmes moved with quiet purpose, his long fingers skimming the edges of the desk, the open drawers, the carpet. He knelt beside the body, examining the hands, the wound and the area beneath her nails. "No signs of struggle," he muttered. "Curious. Wouldn't a heart wound fell her immediately?" I asked. "Precisely," Holmes said, "which means she knew her attacker. She did not scream or resist. And look here, no defensive wounds, no bruises, no sign she was restrained." The killer approached calmly, perhaps even face to face. He turned his attention to the writing desk. A sheet of cream stationery lay beneath a silver-capped inkwell, its contents the same note Lestrade had quoted earlier. "The truth comes out tonight, no matter what she says." Holmes examined the ink with a jeweler's loupe, then lifted the blotting paper and held it to the gaslight. A faint mirror image of the same sentence appeared, confirming the note had been penned here, last night. Watson, meanwhile, glanced at the books lined up along a modest shelf, educational manuals, volumes of history, a collection of poetry. Nothing overtly personal. Holmes stood suddenly and crossed to the wardrobe. "Miss Arbuthnot kept her clothing in meticulous order," he said. "But notice one of her evening gowns is missing. Perhaps taken to be cleaned." Holmes shook his head. "The other gowns have corresponding garment covers. This one does not. She wore it last night and never returned it. The staff saw her retire before 10. "Yes, so they say," Lestrade replied. "No one saw her again until the housemaid found her this morning." Holmes's gaze narrowed. "Then let us ask Lady Fenwick where her governess truly spent the evening." As we descended once more to the drawing room, the tension in the household was palpable. A footman passed us with a tray and avoided eye contact. From somewhere in the distance, a clock chimed the hour, 11. Lady Fenwick received us in a tastefully decorated room with lilac wallpaper and a fire crackling in the grate. She was tall, elegant, her fair hair drawn into a chignon, and her face, though composed, bore the unmistakable signs of fatigue and restraint. She greeted Lestrade with the faintest nod, but her eyes quickly found Holmes. "You must be Mr. Sherlock Holmes," she said, her voice smooth and precise. "I've heard of you, of course. I regret that we must meet under such circumstances." "I regret more the loss of Miss Arbuthnot," Holmes replied. "You knew her well as one ever knows an employee. She was efficient, well-spoken. The children were fond of her." Holmes's tone remained cordial. "And last evening you were at the Criterion Theatre with Lady Weatherby and her niece. We dined afterward, then returned to Weatherby House in Belgrave Square. I stayed the night. And Miss Arbuthnot, you saw her when you came home." Lady Fenwick hesitated. "I did not return home, Mr. Holmes. I already stated that to Inspector Lestrade. I haven't seen Miss Arbuthnot since yesterday morning." Holmes steepled his fingers. "Curious then that she left a note last night, claiming the truth would come out, no matter what she says. A phrase which might easily suggest you." Her composure flickered, just for a moment. "You're suggesting I had something to hide." "I suggest only that the timelines are worth exploring. A cabman reports that you were dropped at a townhouse in Chelsea around midnight. A separate witness claims you remained in Belgrave Square." "I can't explain that," she said coldly. "Perhaps the cabman was mistaken. Perhaps he took someone else for me." Holmes said nothing, merely rose and offered a slight bow. "Thank you, Lady Fenwick. That will be all for now. As we stepped into the hallway, he murmured, the performance was elegant, but the seams are beginning to show. Lestrade frowned. So which alibi do we break first? Neither, Holmes said. We begin by confirming which of them was ever real. And Miss Arbuthnot's note. I believe she saw something she shouldn't have, Holmes said. Something that required her to be silenced, cleanly, quietly, and without commotion. That requires more than rage, Watson. It requires planning. He glanced back toward the staircase, his eyes narrowing. And someone, I believe, went to great lengths to make sure they weren't seen. Holmes wasted no time. The moment we stepped beyond the threshold of Lady Fenwick's drawing room, he turned sharply on his heel, and beckoned me silently to follow him. Lestrade trailed behind, frowning, still digesting Holmes's earlier cryptic remark. Rather than returning to the scene of the crime, Holmes made for the rear of the house, descending the narrow servants' stairwell into the kitchen corridor. The air was heavy with the scent of last night's cooking, cold beef and onion, and the dull clatter of a scullery maid washing up. Your instincts take you below stairs, I asked quietly. Indeed, Watson. The top of the house contains the body, but the bottom may hold the answers. We entered the kitchen where two housemaids and the cook sat stiffly at the long wooden table, evidently awaiting further questioning. They rose hastily at our entrance, smoothing aprons and shifting awkwardly on their feet. Holmes gave a polite incline of the head. Forgive the intrusion. I am Mr. Sherlock Holmes. I should like to ask you each a few questions, nothing too taxing, merely a confirmation of what has already been recorded. The cook, a stout woman with ruddy cheeks and a voice like gravel, was the first to speak. We've told the inspector everything, sir. Poor Miss Arbuthnot. She was a kind soul. Holmes nodded. I'm sure she was. Did any of you see or hear her last night, after 10 o'clock? The maids shook their heads in unison, but the cook hesitated. Speak freely, Holmes encouraged. I thought I heard someone come down the stairs just after midnight. I can't say it was her. Could have been one of the family. I was nearly asleep. Was the sound distinct? Holmes pressed. A single set of footsteps. More. Just the one. Light-footed. I thought perhaps the missus had come down for something. Holmes tapped a finger against his chin. Did you hear the front door? No, sir. Holmes exchanged a glance with Lestrade. Then either our late Miss Arbuthnot left through another exit, or she never left at all. He turned to the younger maid, a slight girl with nervous eyes. Is there another way out of the house? A tradesman's entrance, perhaps? She nodded. Yes, sir. Round the back of the scullery. It opens onto a narrow alley. Sometimes the children use it when they sneak off with the governess to the park. Holmes's eyes gleamed. Show me. Moments later we were outside, our boots squelching faintly against the wet flagstones. The alley behind the house was narrow and hemmed in by brick walls, its mouth opening onto a wider lane that led toward the mews. Holmes knelt examining the ground by the threshold of the tradesman's door. He produced a magnifying lens and studied the damp stone. There, he murmured. A partial heel mark, woman's boot, small high arch, likely Miss Arbuthnot's. And here he shifted slightly, pointing toward a faint streak of mud on the bottom of the door frame. Someone returned in haste. The smear suggests the edge of a skirt or coat brushed against it. So she left, Lestrade said, squinting, and came back again. It would seem so, but we must determine when and, more importantly, why. Holmes stood and began walking the length of the alley. I followed, uncertain what he sought. When he reached the mouth of the lane he paused, then pointed to a boot scraper mounted beside a tradesman's entrance 2 doors down. This one is missing its brush, he noted. I frowned. Significant. He didn't answer directly. Instead he asked the maid, who had followed at a cautious distance, Is Miss Arbuthnot known to be meticulous? Oh yes, sir, she replied. Always neat. She'd brush her shoes before entering, even when the weather was dry. Holmes crouched once more, brushing a fingertip along the edge of the flagstone by the door. Mud, a different consistency from the one near the scullery door. From another part of town perhaps, somewhere with a clay-based soil. He rose. Gentlemen, I believe Miss Arbuthnot went out last night, unseen, and returned. She was not murdered in her sleep, but after a secret errand, one she believed dangerous enough to warrant a written warning. Lestrade was still scowling. But where could she have gone? And why? That, my dear Lestrade, is what we shall now endeavor to learn. Back inside the house, Holmes turned his attention to Miss Arbuthnot's personal effects. While her bedroom had yielded little save the letter, her modest bureau in the adjoining dressing room proved more fruitful. Within its lower drawer, Holmes found a small lockbox. He extracted a thin blade from his coat, and with deft pressure, sprung the latch. Inside lay a collection of letters, some tied with string, others folded loosely, and a pocket diary bound in worn blue leather. Holmes removed the diary and handed the rest to me. "Check the postmarks," he said absently, already leafing through the diary's pages. The diary was filled in a neat, precise hand. Most entries were routine: lessons with the Fenwick children, appointments, occasional mentions of outings to the park or theater. But two entries caught Holmes's eye. November 4th, Lady F left abruptly after receiving a telegram. Returned very late. Odd tension next day. November 6th, came to me tonight, nervous. Asked if I'd seen anyone. Said I must forget if I had. Something is wrong. Holmes closed the diary slowly. "Watson, those letters, mostly from a cousin in Bath," I said, sorting through the envelopes. "But here this one is different." I handed him a letter on fine cream paper, with an embossed crest, a lion rampant clutching a rose. Holmes opened it and scanned the contents. His eyes narrowed. "Well," he said softly, "now this becomes interesting." The letter, dated 3 weeks prior, was from a man named Basil Courtenay, a name I had not heard before. It was short and formal, requesting a meeting with Miss Arbuthnot to discuss certain past associations that might affect Lady Fenwick's current standing. "Past associations," I repeated. "Indeed," Holmes murmured. "Lady Fenwick was born Margaret Courtenay, daughter of the late Viscount Elmhurst. This man Basil is her cousin, and what would he want with the governess?" Holmes looked at me, then at Lestrade. "That," he said, folding the letter with care, "is the question that may have gotten her killed." He paced once, then twice, as the pieces shifted in his mind. "I believe Miss Arbuthnot was coerced into silence at first, but something changed. Perhaps she uncovered the full truth, and decided to act. Perhaps the letter from Basil Courtenay prompted her. Whatever the case, she made a plan to speak out. She wrote her note, and someone ensured she would not speak again." "And you think Lady Fenwick—" "I think," Holmes interrupted gently, "we must next pay a visit to Mr. Basil Courtenay." Our journey to Basil Courtenay's residence took us across the city into the genteel quarter of Kensington, where the fog hung thinner, and the houses stood with a quiet ancestral dignity. Holmes, despite the chill in the air, had opened the carriage window slightly, and was drumming his fingers in a slow, absent rhythm along the sill. It was a sure sign that his mind was dancing ahead, pulling at threads only he could yet see. "Do you know much of this Courtenay fellow?" I asked as the cab clattered through a narrow mews. Holmes nodded without looking at me. "The Courtenay name belongs to one of the older peerage lines, long-standing, not particularly wealthy, and lately afflicted by scandal. Basil is a cousin to Lady Fenwick, a man of some reputation for subtle indiscretions. His name has surfaced in relation to debts, gaming clubs, and certain whispered affairs, though nothing ever proven. Hardly the type to write a polite letter to a governess," I said. "Just so, Watson, and yet he did, which makes him either a man attempting to right a wrong, or one covering his tracks." We arrived at a tall, narrow house on Gloucester Road, its red brick facade softened by ivy and age. A manservant with a trim mustache showed us into a drawing-room of faintly worn grandeur, where Basil Courtenay awaited us by the fireplace. He was in his mid-40s, immaculately dressed, his dark hair streaked with silver at the temples. The eyes, though, those were bright and calculating. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," he said smoothly. "I had wondered when you might arrive. I read about Miss Arbuthnot's death this morning. A tragic business." Holmes's tone was light but firm. "Tragic, yes, but not, I suspect, unexpected to you." Courtenay's brow twitched slightly. "I beg your pardon. You wrote to Miss Arbuthnot 3 weeks ago," Holmes continued, "requesting a meeting, discussing past associations relating to Lady Fenwick. The timing suggests urgency. Might we ask what prompted that letter?" Courtenay's eyes narrowed, though he maintained a composed facade. "It was delicate. Lydia, Miss Arbuthnot, once worked at a house in Wiltshire.
The manor of an old friend of mine, Algernon Delbridge. She was governess to his children before joining the Fenwicks. Holmes said nothing, waiting. Well, Courtenay continued, there was an incident, a scandal that never reached the papers, I might add. Lord Delbridge's eldest son had taken an interest in the girl. It became rather complicated. Rumors spread that she had come into possession of letters, intimate ones. There was even talk of blackmail, though I never credited it. And you feared those letters might resurface, Holmes said mildly. Courtenay gave a shallow nod. I had hoped to quietly retrieve them. For Lady Fenwick's sake, you understand. She was once engaged to that same young man, before he married a French countess, and conveniently vanished to Paris. Any renewed gossip would reflect poorly on her. Did Miss Arbuthnot agree to meet with you? Holmes asked. She sent a reply. Said she had nothing to discuss, that she'd left that part of her life behind. Holmes drew a folded envelope from his coat pocket, the original letter from Courtenay, found in the governess's locked box. You may be pleased to know she kept your letter, he said, watching Courtenay's reaction. But you understand the implication, Mr. Courtenay. If someone believed those letters did exist, whether or not they did, that belief could provide motive. Courtenay's composure wavered. Surely you don't think Holmes, I wrote to her. I did not kill her. Then you must tell us who else might have known of the Delbridge affair. Courtenay hesitated, then poured himself a brandy from a sideboard decanter before speaking again. There was one other, Leonard Darnley, Delbridge's solicitor at the time, a thoroughly disagreeable man. He handled the matter quietly, ensured Miss Arbuthnot's departure with a generous reference, and saw to it that the letters, if any, were never mentioned again. I haven't seen him in years, but if anyone feared those ghosts returning, it might be him. We left Courtenay's house shortly after, with Holmes unusually silent as we rode back through Kensington's winding streets. The name Leonard Darnley meant nothing to me, but Holmes seemed to turn it over in his mind as though weighing an unspoken possibility. You believe this solicitor might have more to gain than Courtenay? I asked at last. Not more, Holmes said quietly, but perhaps more to lose. Later that evening, back at Baker Street, Holmes immersed himself in the records he kept on London's legal men, drawers of newspaper clippings, court records, and bar association proceedings. At last he found what he was looking for. Leonard Darnley, he announced, once disbarred under suspicion of financial impropriety, quietly reinstated after a year abroad, now operating a private legal consultancy in Bloomsbury, discreet, well-connected, and rarely in the public eye. Precisely the kind of man one consults when one needs a scandal buried, and possibly the kind of man who would kill to keep it buried. Exactly, Watson. Holmes penned a quick note, which he handed to a messenger boy, with instructions to deliver it to Darnley's office the next morning, under the guise of an inquiry into a fictitious trust matter. Then he settled into his chair with a sigh. There is something about Miss Arbuthnot's final night that remains murky, he said. She ventured out, likely to meet someone. She returned not in fear, but with resolve. Her note was not a plea, it was a declaration. She intended to speak, I said. Holmes nodded, and someone ensured she would not. The next morning brought a swift reply. Darnley's clerk, a young man named Finch, confirmed an appointment, had indeed been scheduled with a Miss Lydia Arbuthnot 2 nights before her death. She had arrived promptly at 9, remained for nearly an hour, and departed alone. She must have confronted him, I said. Or he confronted her. Holmes replied, it depends on who summoned whom. We visited Darnley's office that afternoon. It was a dim set of rooms above a bookshop, sparsely furnished and perfumed faintly with old paper and pipe tobacco. Darnley himself was in his 60s, sharp-featured and cold-eyed. He rose when we entered, but his handshake was dry and indifferent. You've come about Miss Arbuthnot, he said at once. A dreadful business. You met with her 2 nights ago, Holmes said. We'd like to know why. She came seeking protection, Darnley said, surprising us both. She believed someone was following her. She claimed a man had approached her in the park, questioned her about her past position in Wiltshire. She was frightened, enough to consult a solicitor. And did you advise her? I told her she had nothing to fear, that no claim could be brought. She thanked me, seemed relieved. Then she left. Holmes studied Darnley for a long moment. Did she mention the name Courtenay? A pause, barely a second, but it was there. She may have, Darnley said. I didn't press her. I didn't press her. I didn't press her.
As we stepped out into the street once more, Holmes said nothing for a full block. Then he turned to me. She was being hunted, Watson, but not for blackmail. She was a loose thread, one that someone intended to snip. And Darnley is hiding something. But he's not a killer. No, I think he's protecting someone else. The mist had returned by the time we reached the corner. Holmes stopped, the wind tugging faintly at his coat. We must return to the Fenwick house. There's something I missed. You think the answer lies there? I know it does. We have suspects and secrets, Watson. But what we lack, what we must find, is the unseen hand that tied this all together. The fog was thicker when we returned to Cadogan Square that evening, curling around the gas lamps and muffling the city's usual thrum to a low, distant murmur. Holmes stood for a moment outside the Fenwick townhouse, his sharp profile outlined against the glow of the streetlight, head tilted slightly upward as if listening to something inaudible to the rest of us. Then, without a word, he mounted the steps and knocked briskly. We were admitted by the same footman as before, who led us without ceremony to the study, a room we had yet to visit. It was paneled in dark walnut, lined with shelves of serious volumes, and a single glass cabinet containing mementos of Sir Giles's travels, a Roman oil lamp, a carved elephant's tusk, and a miniature suit of Japanese armor. The scent of sandalwood hung faintly in the air. Lady Fenwick was not present. Holmes made no inquiry after her. "Leave us," he said to the footman, who glanced at me, uncertain, then bowed and withdrew. The door clicked shut. Holmes moved to the writing desk beneath the window. It was immaculate, an array of pens and sealing wax arranged with geometrical precision. He ran a finger along the inside edge of a drawer and drew it back, examining a speck of red wax under his fingernail. "Sealed correspondence," he murmured, almost to himself. "Not from Sir Giles, I think." He lifted a blotter and underneath found a crumpled scrap of paper that had fallen between the desk and its inner lip. Flattening it carefully, he held it toward the lamp. It was only half a sentence, "Only if she talks, otherwise we are safe." My heart quickened. Whose handwriting is that? Holmes did not answer immediately. He tucked the paper into his pocket, his gaze now fixed on the cabinet of curios. With a sudden motion, he stepped to it, opened the glass door, and reached behind the Roman oil lamp. From the shadows, he withdrew a small black notebook, scarcely larger than a cigarette case, bound in cracked leather. "Too carefully hidden to be Sir Giles's," he said, "and too recent to belong to any traveler." He opened it. I stepped beside him, and over his shoulder I glimpsed several pages in a fine, slanted hand, entries dated over the past 3 months. Each was terse, emotional in tone, and utterly damning. August 22nd, she refuses to forget. The fool, she believes in justice as if it still exists in this world. September 2nd, if Basil interferes again, I'll handle it myself. His sense of gallantry will be his undoing. October 11th, Darnley sent word. She asked questions. It won't be long before she realizes it all. November 6th, tonight it ends. I looked at Holmes, whose expression had gone still. "Who? Lady Fenwick," he said softly. "No doubt remains, but she has an alibi." "She has two," Holmes snapped, "and both were engineered." He closed the book and slipped it inside his coat. "Watson, every fact has been arranged with the care of a stage production. Lady Fenwick knew Miss Arbuthnot's past, feared its resurfacing, and set about erasing the threat with the precision of a surgeon. She misled Courtenay, involved Darnley, and fabricated alibis with 2 separate witnesses, each honest enough to believe what she let them see. We returned to the upper floor. Holmes moved with increasing urgency now, stopping briefly at the threshold of Miss Arbuthnot's room before continuing down the corridor to Lady Fenwick's chambers. He knocked once, then entered. She was seated at her vanity, still dressed in black, her reflection meeting ours in the mirror. Her features betrayed no surprise, only the faintest tightening around her mouth. "You've found something," she said. Holmes bowed slightly. "Merely a few inconsistencies. I hoped you might clarify them." She turned to face us, hands folded neatly in her lap. I've already given my statement. Twice. Indeed, but you'll forgive me if I find it somewhat composed. Lady Fenwick's eyes narrowed. And what precisely do you accuse me of, Mr. Holmes? I accuse you of devising not one but two overlapping false alibis, Holmes said coolly. Of enlisting the naive trust of your friend Lady Weatherby, and misleading a cabman into believing you went to Chelsea when in truth you were already at home, or rather preparing for murder. Her jaw tightened. You left the theater early, dismissed your carriage with instructions to wait, then walked the few streets to Cadogan Square. Holmes continued. You entered through the back, likely using a duplicate key, easy enough to obtain in one's own household. You waited until Miss Arbuthnot returned, after her visit to Darnley no doubt, and then, when she believed herself safe, you struck. She was a threat, Lady Fenwick said, her voice suddenly low. You think I couldn't see it? She was clever, too clever, and stubborn. She wouldn't stop. She had no idea what the consequences would be. She wrote a note, Holmes said. A declaration, not a warning. She was going to speak. I know, Lady Fenwick replied. She left it on her desk so I'd see it. A final act of defiance. You read it before you killed her, Holmes said. Did you hesitate? For a moment I thought she would deny it, but then she looked away, toward the cold grate of the fireplace. She threatened everything, she whispered. Giles's reputation, the children's future. My marriage may be a fiction, Mr. Holmes, but the title, his fortune, those are real, and I protected them. Holmes's voice was quiet. And what of Lydia Arbuthnot's life? She chose the battlefield, she said bitterly. I merely fought on it. Lestrade entered at that moment, having arrived shortly before at Holmes's telegrammed request. Holmes turned to him and gave a brief nod. You may arrest her, Inspector. Lady Fenwick stood without protest. I hope, Mr. Holmes, she said, as she was led out, that you're satisfied with your cleverness. But Holmes did not respond. He stood by the hearth, silent, watching the flames that were no longer lit. Later, as we rode home, I studied his profile in the dim carriage. The lines around his mouth were drawn tighter than usual. She was no fool, I said. No, he replied. She was brilliant. Cold but brilliant, the kind of brilliance that corrodes. And Arbuthnot, a moralist, he said. In a house full of masks. The fog pressed in against the glass. We said no more. Only the quiet creak of the wheels filled the space between us. It was not yet noon when a messenger arrived at Baker Street, his coat soaked with rain, and his breath fogging as he handed Holmes a folded telegram. Holmes opened it without ceremony, scanned the contents, and then stood abruptly, crossing to the fire, as if to absorb warmth from more than the hearth. I looked up from my chair. Bad news. His expression was unreadable. From Lestrade. Lady Fenwick attempted suicide in her cell last night. She used the wire from her corset to cut her wrist. The matron found her in time. She'll live. My stomach turned slightly. That's not an admission of guilt, it's despair. Holmes said nothing for a moment. Then with sudden intensity, he took the black notebook we had retrieved from the Fenwick study and laid it open on the table. He turned to the last entry, the words "tonight, it ends," and tapped them twice with his finger. I took this as a confession, a prelude to murder. But now, I begin to wonder, what if it was something else entirely? You're doubting the case? I asked, startled. You led Lestrade to her arrest. I led Lestrade to the logical conclusion, Holmes said. But logic, Watson, is only as sound as its premise. I assumed the writer of the journal was Lady Fenwick. But what if that assumption was incorrect? I felt the tug of unease. Then who? He looked up. Let us revisit one thing. The letter from Basil Courtenay to Miss Arbuthnot, found in her locked box. It referenced Lady Fenwick's past, but made no direct threat. Courtenay claimed to protect his cousin's reputation. Darnley, too, admitted the meeting with Arbuthnot was prompted by fear. But both men agreed. The governess seemed resolved, not panicked. Yet she wrote that note, I said slowly. The truth comes out tonight. So what if the entry in the journal wasn't hers, or not Lady Fenwick's? Holmes turned the page backward. The penmanship here is not the same as the note found on her desk. Similar, yes, but not identical. He strode to the shelf, seized a magnifying glass, and returned to the table. With it he compared the diary to the note and the letters from the trunk. "Watson," he said quietly, "this journal was not written by Margaret Fenwick, nor by Lydia Arbuthnot. Then who?" He lifted his eyes to mine. "Sir Giles." My mouth fell open, but he was away that night. His alibi is the neatest of them all. Witnessed at his club, a porter saw him into the Carlton Hotel at midnight. Holmes closed the book. But the club and the hotel are both run by staff who serve discretion above all. If he left by the back, or bribed a doorman, no one would speak of it. But why would he want her dead? I asked. What threat did she pose to him? Holmes went to the fireplace, retrieving the crumpled scrap he'd found beneath the study blotter. He smoothed it again, and read the partial sentence aloud. "Only if she talks. Otherwise we are safe." Then he took the diary and aligned its torn page edge with the scrap. A perfect match. "Watson," he said, "this is the missing page from the diary. It was not dropped, it was torn hastily, perhaps in panic." "Then the diary belonged to him all along," I said slowly. "It was his mind unraveling, not hers." Holmes nodded grimly. He was the spider at the center of the web. Courtenay, Darnley, even Margaret, none of them knew the full picture. Arbuthnot discovered something that led her back not to Lady Fenwick's past, but to her husband's, and it was he who silenced her. "But how?" I asked. "She was killed in her own room. There were no signs of forced entry. The house was locked." "Precisely," Holmes replied. "He had a key. By the time we returned to Cadogan Square, the house was quiet. Sir Giles had returned the previous evening, claiming to come home early from a business trip after hearing the news. We were received in the library, where he sat beside the decanter, dressed in black and offering all the manner of a grieving employer. His hair was grayer than I remembered, his temples a touch hollowed by either grief or something more corrosive. "Gentlemen," he greeted, "come to look in on us again. I'm afraid my wife is indisposed." "We are here to speak with you," Holmes said calmly, "about Miss Arbuthnot, and about the diary." Sir Giles looked up slowly, and for the first time I noticed something in his eyes, fatigue perhaps, or the creeping edge of defeat. "What of it?" "You recognize this," Holmes said, producing the small black book. "It was hidden in your study. And this scrap," he produced the torn fragment, "matches a missing page. The handwriting, though disguised, matches letters filed under your name at the Royal Geographical Society." Sir Giles's expression did not change, but his fingers tightened subtly on the arm of the chair. "She knew," Holmes said, "not of Margaret's past, not of Delbridge. She knew something about you, and the moment she declared her intention to expose it, you acted. You returned that night, through the back entrance, one the staff would not have monitored. She let you in, trusted you, and you killed her." Sir Giles's silence stretched into something taut and unnatural. "She had a journal of her own," he said at last, his voice very low. "Did you find that too?" Holmes blinked. "No, there was nothing else in her desk. She hid it," Giles said. "I could never find it, but she wrote everything down, even our conversations, the things I said when I was angry. She thought she could fix me." "What did she know?" Holmes asked. Giles leaned back, his eyes drifting to the window as the fog pressed at the glass. "That I used funds from a trust, that I paid debts not mine to pay, that I made certain appointments in Cairo disappear, documents, transfers, men." And she pieced it all together. Somehow she saw me more clearly than anyone ever had. He exhaled heavily. "She said I should come clean. She gave me until the end of the week. And you chose instead to end her life," Holmes said. Sir Giles met his gaze then, with an eerie sort of calm. "I chose to protect what's mine. This house, my name, my family. And now you've taken it anyway." When we stepped outside, the first drops of rain had begun to fall. Holmes paused on the steps, his face unreadable. "Will Lestrade believe us?" I asked. Holmes glanced back at the door. "He will once he reads what's in that diary. I left it with Lady Fenwick's solicitor. The truth has always been there, Watson. It only needed the right light to be seen. Right light to be seen. Right light.